This conference will now be recorded.
Well, I want to welcome everybody again today, and I have talked about manure application once before on these webinars. It was primarily focused on fall application or maybe even summer application, but I had a request from one of the members to talk about spring manure application in the context of cover crops. So that is the subject matter we have today. And if you have any questions later on, we'll stop for time or two for that. But I just wanted to jump right into it here. And the topics I want to cover today is basically timing. And of course, we're talking about spring, but that word timing there more has to do with, is it late or should I say in March, or is it May? In that normal time frame when there's a lot of manure going out. What is the cover crop growth stage at the point we apply manure? What are some rates, methods of application, and how do we adjust fertility in the context of manure, and I should say cover crops as well? And then it's important to understand burn down herbicide management. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I still see some fields once in a while that don't have any cover crops on, and over the winter, and then there's people out there spreading manure on them. So why no cover crops? Why don't you plant a cover crop there? Because it does so much good in capturing the nutrients that are there, keeps them in their place, keeps them from running off. And it would be my biased opinion, I might say, that having applying manure, if at all possible, should be done in the context of cover cropping. It certainly makes it more valuable. It maximizes the opportunity you have with the nutrients are there, and also minimizes pollution. And I am going to talk about that a little bit today, because it is something we as farmers, if we don't literally clean up our act, we're going to get more regulated in this area. So it is my desire to tell farmers, let's do this right to try to keep regulations off our back. But it seems like there's always some rogue farmers out there that, for whatever reason, they just think that they can do what they want. And I think we can do better. We will have to do better if we don't do it on our own. So it helps to understand a little bit about the growth of cover crops. And when you have I know we're talking about the spring here, but I will flip back to the fall. If you have a freshly emerging cover crop, applying manure is not a good idea at that point. Cereal rye is probably the toughest one. On this picture here in the lower right-hand corner is a radish seed just germinating. You hit that with like hog manure, that radish seed, good chance it may even die because it'll burn it off from basically the nitrogen or whatever that's in that manure. In the spring, we generally don't have a freshly lush little seedling growing up, but you may have little seedlings like the rye you have pictured here in the spring. So we're going to talk about rates here coming up, but this is where you certainly wouldn't want to go very heavy, or you could actually smother your cover crop, whatever it might be growing when it's early. So keep this in mind if we're going early with manure. And dairy manure tends to be thicker, more of a slurry. Hog manure seems to be thinner. Then you can have some dry manures that, if you have a good spread pattern, you can get away with a lot, because simply not much of the manure actually touches the seedlings, but some will. Some of the little pieces that are scattered out will actually go on top of these, and it could take out some of your cover crop. So this is something you have to kind of understand, that if you had a late planted cover crop and you have to haul manure early, you got to do what you got to do. But you may be hindering some of it when you do it. It's just pretty much common sense stuff. But typically the cover crop does start to grow in the spring, and a lot of the cover crops that you would be putting manure on are cereal rye. And that's simply because most dairy farmers a lot of them are growing cereal rye, if not for their own forage, but it just seems to be pretty popular in dairy farms. They have manure, and rye is a grass, and it takes up nitrogen, which is the most leachable form, the most leachable nutrient that's within that manure. So when you put manure out at this stage, 4 inches or higher, the chances of survival are very, very good. You still got to be judicious in that. So just wanted to cover some of the basics along those lines of how much, what rate can you do, and you get used to this as you do it, and some are know exactly what to do in this. So I would say a really basic rule of thumb in the rates when liquid 6,000 gallons or less, particularly dairy manure. Um, it's my understanding, and from what I experience with hog manure, you generally don't like to put much more than that on anyway. From a kind of a solid perspective, or from the solids that are in a hog manure liquid, it's not very much. You could probably put more on that, wouldn't smother it, but it might burn it. Hog manure can burn that leaves of that cover crop a little bit more. And then if it's dry, like you see in the background picture there, spreading manure on, I'm saying 10 tons or less, you get a little higher than that, you're going to start to smother it out. I also have here under the rate section, avoid overlaps. And you want to have an operator who is responsible, who cares. Not only is it from a nutrient perspective, but if you double up a fairly thick stand of rye, you may have problems. And it can grow enough that the next rain you get, or later on in the spring, or right before planting, if you're going to plant right into that rye literally goes down, like you see in the picture here. Now, it's not always because of overlaps. It's sometimes there's just simply nutrient variations within the field that you really have no idea are there when you spread. But suffices it is to say, I always say spread manure like you're spreading fertilizer, and you're going to be good. So you want to do a good job of that, because we're not going to talk about planting into this today, but I'm just telling you, save yourself a lot of trouble. If you're going to be planting into a heavy cover, and we were talking before we started recording here, how some of these cover crops are getting a little tall and they could start going down. That's very difficult to plant across the stems of lodged cover crops, of lodged rye, particularly these grasses that once they start heading out, those stems start getting pretty solid, and it's difficult to cut them with a coulter. So we'll be talking more about that next week, but suffices to say, do a good job of application. Now, there's another thing that farmers need to think about, is in the context of their seeding rates. And of course, this is old news if you already got it planted, but in the future, if you're seeing that your cover crop and rye, triticale, that kind of thing, if it's going down before you want it to, you may be planting it too thick, and a little thinner stand would be better. You really want to eliminate lodging, because that is a problem to plant. And I'm saying this a couple times because it is that important. We're going to talk about forage here coming up, because these dairy farmers are looking at that and saying, man, that should have been cut a week ago. We could have put that in the silo. That makes awesome feed, and it sure does. We're going to talk about that later. But for those who are not taking this all for forage, think about your seeding rates. And if you've seen a lot of this, you want to use lower seeding rates the next year, so you don't get this. That's the key to doing that. And again, that's falls under the under the management factor there. So keep the seeding rates lower according to how it grows in your farms and each of your fields. You know your fields. Some definitely have a history of manure, and you just don't need as much, or you just need a less seeding rate so it doesn't go down. Of course, emphasize grass type cover crops, triticale, cereal rye, annual ryegrass. I say limit the use of legumes. I don't say eliminate them, because I like diversity. And even though the legumes may not be needed to function so much as to make nitrogen for your subsequent crop, they're just part of the synergy. That's part of the mix. I can't explain it. I just know that diversity is good. And I would still put a few legumes like a hairy vetch, crimson clover. If you're talking the fall planting here, even if you're expecting to put a little manure on, I would put a little in. And it's more for whatever that gives you from a diversity standpoint. And sometimes if you don't get manure onto the spring, those little legumes will help your grass or the crops grow a little bit better over the weekend, over the over the winter, I should say. So you're able to get a nice stand, and then when you put manure on in the spring, off it goes. There are different methods to put manure on, and I'm not going to go into a lot of time of that. You guys know what they are, what you might be working with. Drag lining is certainly an option that's very favorable if you have the terrain that can handle it, and so forth. I'll say this picture I took. This happened to be in the fall. This was up in New York State, where the guy had a couple thousand acres, a large dairy farm, and just made a lot of sense. I mean, he was he was well over a mile away from the pit, and this is just an ideal way. Just on a side note here, most of you know I'm from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. We have a lot of Amish around here, and you might be surprised to know that the Amish are now drag lining manure. I don't have a picture yet. I want to get it sometime, but it's pretty cool to see 4 mules pulling a drag line out across the field. And when you think about the Amish and having to use horses, it certainly saves a lot of trips with the spreader. And I was talking about one Amish neighbor who had a haul some manure, and I said, "Why aren't you drag line?" He said, "Well," he said, "it just doesn't work with the way his fields are lined up for where he wanted to put it in the spring." And he has his alfalfa growing, and because as the fields are in strips, the line would have been going over some of his other fields back and forth. That would have knocked his alfalfa down. But the point is, they got this thing all set up now to drag line manure. So I thought you'd find that somewhat interesting just to know that. So of course, putting it on with tankers and so forth is very popular. I don't have any pictures of injecting it. I know that some areas are requiring manure to be injected, and if that's a requirement, that's what you got to do. My argument would be, and we had this, I guess you'd say, debate slash discussion in the context of the Chesapeake Bay. I remember when the awareness of the problems of the Chesapeake Bay came to light, the original idea was to force farmers to inject the manure, and kind of got around that by saying now that if you have a cover crop planted in your field, you don't need to inject unless you want to be kind to your neighbors if you're farming near a suburb and you want to put it in for the sake of smell. But for the sake of an agronomy standpoint, it's just not a bad practice to put manure on top of growing covers as long as you do it right, and that is not too much, and so forth. So this is just some of the ways that it can be applied. I wouldn't mind hearing from you when we pause here in a second to hear a little bit more about that. Let's just talk a little bit about herbicide application and the timing, because this has come up to be sometimes a problem in this. And this is particularly with those who are letting it grow and you're not going to be taking it all for forage. So when do you put a herbicide on? Before or after the manure is applied? Again, we're talking about a growing cover crop. I have learned this the hard way myself on my farm, where I was going to plant some corn and had the opportunity to get some manure hauled in from a neighbor. It was liquid hog manure, and they spread it on the field. And I don't think it was 2 days afterwards I was able to go in and plant, and I sprayed to kill the cereal rye in this case. And every little tiny area that they missed with manure, I had a perfect kill of my cereal rye. And where 99.9% of the field that was covered with hog manure just sprayed 2 days before, I had to respray everything. And that could, that was Roundup or glyphosate. And again, this was quite a few years ago, but I had no idea. And the hog manure does not really cover the leaf surface much. But I have listed here, and it's kind of pretty common sense for something like cow manure, that it may indeed splatter and cover the leaf surfaces where the leaf surface doesn't get enough herbicide to go in. But there's something about it tying up the herbicide. And I've excuse me, I've even heard some people say that after a rain or two, sometimes they can tell where the misses were in a given manure application because it just didn't kill as good. So this is one thing where I highly recommend. It makes it a little tricky here, but I highly recommend that you are able to get your herbicide sprayed on first, manure applied, and get your field planted. And if you heard me speak before about this whole thing, the risk in this is, what if it rains after you have your herbicide applied to your cover crop, and then that field will be very difficult to dry out. So that is kind of a little bit of a conundrum here in how you manage a manure application. So I would strongly suggest that if you can, apply your manure early, and most people do. So I'm just telling you, this is kind of a little caveat here in spring manure application. If you, for whatever reason, couldn't get in the field or whatever, had to wait, whatever, you need to be aware that the herbicide could be tied up just with the manure being there. So I'm going to pause here a little bit. I want to back up actually for some questions here on manure application and cover crops in the spring. So who would have a comment or a question on that aspect on manure application in the spring? How you hearing it's done, or what do you recommend, or what has worked for you? Anybody want to comment on that? I just wondered, Cody, from your standpoint, you must be working with some guys with manure. What are you seeing? How are they handling manure and cover crops in the spring?
Well, I'll be honest, this was kind of an opportunity for me to learn, not something I've dealt with a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
And working with a customer in particular who is looking to have dairy manure spread on cereal rye.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously their concern at this point is it's going to be getting pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I just thought of a question here.
Yeah.
If the rye is maybe 4, 5, 6 foot tall,
Mm-hmm.
they weren't able to spray
Mm-hmm.
ahead of manure application,
Mm-hmm.
and manure got applied, they came back in, got planted, and if they came in with a roller crimper shortly after and crimped everything down and then sprayed later, would you see a problem with that after a couple rains?
That's an option.
Okay.
There again, you said after a couple rains. In that case, I would want to make sure I have Roundup Ready corn in case it spears through or comes up.
Right.
That it won't hurt the corn. I would say that would have to be part of that equation. Awfully risky any other way.
Okay.
And the other thing too, Cody, and you bring up a good point. I remember when I did this, I was working with cereal rye that was only about 2 feet tall. As I remember, just like in boot stage.
Mm-hmm.
Which what you're talking about here is headed, and it is easier to kill at that standpoint, at that maturity.
Right.
So it could be that you could be able to, like after a rain or maybe between spraying and rolling, as you said, you could probably take it out. So in the scenario you just described, I don't think it is as hard to do as the way I described it.
Okay.
That may not be as much of an issue. I think, you need to be aware of it. I would love to hear how that works out, though, just for all of us to know, because typically manure is not spread on tall cover crops. It just isn't. That's not very common. But hey, it might happen sometime. So what do we need to know to make that work? I think that's the question you're asking. And my suggestion is to, go in and, if the other thing I will tell you, depending on how they apply the manure, if you have, depending on the way the manure comes out of the tank, it could actually blow it. The force of the manure could actually push it different ways. If it comes out the back and is like fanned out. Some are more higher than others. It could actually push the cover crop that would make it difficult to plant through. That's a consideration right there. You follow what I'm saying on that?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, what about
Yeah,
if you
go ahead.
bush hogged? What if you bush hogged the cover crop and then spread your manure? I mean, you wouldn't have nearly the height, and you wouldn't have to worry too much about it reseeding.
Well, if you're going to plant into something that's bush hog, that's very difficult. You would have to be very aggressive on your row cleaners. You just have too much short pieces of material around there, and it tends to stuff down in the seed slot.
Okay.
Now, if you have very aggressive row cleaners and can put down pressure on them and clean it off, you can maybe get away with that. Bush hogging depends on the type of cutter you have. Sometimes doesn't always spread it out evenly. I would rather see you roll it down if you have that option, and then put the manure on, and then plant, and then spray it later. That's probably be an ideal scenario what we're talking about here. But I definitely would not recommend bush hogging. I don't think that's a good idea for what I described there. But other questions on manure application and taller cover crops or anything in the springtime? Okay, I had talked about the about when herbicides are applied. Any questions on that? I mean, we kind of just talked about it a little bit, but anyone else have any other comments or question on herbicide or experience? I would love to hear some other ones experience on herbicides and manure, any interaction or so forth. Anyone have experience in that at all? Okay, well, let's just move on. And I had to put in here, what about manure application in a forage situation? In other words, the typical thing I'm thinking about here is for instance, a dairy farm where you'll have your cereal rye or triticale mainly, and you cut that all for forage, and then you go and you apply manure, and then you plant as soon as possible. That's done a lot in my area. Where I live in southeastern Pennsylvania, most dairy farms now, I would say way more than just a simple majority is actually using some sort of small grain as a forage. Now, some of the bigger guys will plant 1/3 cereal rye, 1/3 triticale, 1/3 wheat, so they can get it off sequentially, and that spreads out. Not only it spreads everything out, it spreads the harvest out, it spreads manure application out, it spreads planting out. It just makes everything, you're kind of hedging your bets, because cereal rye is really only ideal for forage 2 or 3 days, and it when you hit the sweet spot. Triticale maybe 5 or 6 days, and wheat maybe 5 or 6 days, but they mature usually about a week apart. So from a management standpoint, planting those 3 or maybe just 2, cereal rye is going to be the first one, and then it just spreads everything out. And we're talking about manure application today, so in this case it spreads it all out so you can get some corn planted earlier, and get it out there, get it growing. It's also a hedge against the weather, but as we know the way the weather goes, sometimes they all 3 could be bunched up in the same week. That theoretically certainly could happen. But so generally we'll want to get our forage cut off, get that manure spread as soon as possible, and then get right in there to plant. Now there's some creative ways there how to control the cereal rye, because usually they're cutting it at boot stage, and it will regrow at that stage. So some are using Roundup Ready genetics and letting the rye sprout out like 6 or so inches and then terminating it at that point. Others are saying that some people have told me it's amazing how glyphosate can work even on a stubble. But they might come back in later and need to clean up then with a post-emergence herbicide like Accent or something like that, but that's pretty expensive. Don't think you really want to do that a lot. Anyone on here that has a question about the forage situation when you're growing for a forage? Any questions at all on that? So one of the other things that we're dealing with manure, we're dealing with cover crops, there's an interaction between those two concepts. So first of all, if you really want to fine tune things, you should be taking a manure analysis, knowing what is actually in the manure. And you do this a couple times, you'll get zoned into it, but there can be some variance. And if you ever get manure from another farm, you'll want to know what is in that. What is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other things as well. So once you know what that is, you know how much you put down per acre, you can start figuring a few things out. I'm not going to go into the exact science of that, but if there's cover crops involved, it's just important to understand a few things in that. Of course, the weather has an influence, and one of the what should I say, so-called benefits of injecting manure or getting in the soil is that you save some of the nitrogen from volatilizing. And there is definitely some truth to that. You could also argue that some of these manure applications, injectors, they disturb the soil a lot, and you could lose a lot of carbon. You can lose as much carbon almost as you're putting into the ground with the manure. That may be an extreme example. But there's also some injections out there that are working really good now, very, very minimal disturbance. So that technology is really helping. So you almost have to put an equation in this equation. What was the weather like after the manure application? A nice half-inch rain is like really nice to get that nitrate nitrogen into the soil so it doesn't volatilize off. You know, was it sunny or was it rainy? That can make a little bit of a difference. I don't think there's an exact formula out there for this, but it's just something to keep in mind. The other thing I would still recommend that with cereal rye, assume that there's no nitrogen there the first several weeks. Now, if it's in a grains or a forage situation, you've cut that off. It's kind of the soil is essentially at that point. Pretty much you can assume there's no nitrogen there. You put manure down, and if it rains very soon, you that little corn seedling is going to get probably enough nitrogen to start growing. But what if you have 2 or 3 weeks of no rain? That corn could have plenty of nitrogen sitting right there, but not available to it. So it's really recommended to have some nitrogen on the seed, close to the seed, when you're planting after like a cereal rye type cover. Now, if you're planting into a cover that had some legume in it or something like that, then you have to account for that. But the manure will eventually supply some nitrogen. You'll just have to kind of figure out the equation there and on how that all works. So wrapping up our topic today, get your questions ready here about this. We'll be opening up for that. I'm saying that well-managed manure coupled with well-managed cover crops will keep valuable nutrients in the field where they belong. And then that's money in the bank for the farmer and a benefit for the environment. And I alluded early on how this is important. I just took this picture about a month or 6 weeks ago. This is actually the beginnings of the Susquehanna River. And this is up near Cooperstown, New York. The beginning of the Susquehanna River starts from a lake that you can see in the background. I live only 2 miles from the Susquehanna River, a little over 400 miles south of this point as the river flows. It's more direct than that on the road, but as the river flows right there, I'm 400 miles south of that. The Susquehanna River provides over 50% of the water going into the Chesapeake Bay. So all that to say is, in this region, and no matter what watershed you're in, careful management with manure is always going to be under scrutiny. The nice thing about cover crops is we have the opportunity to help keep those nutrients on our fields where they belong and out of these kind of water sources. We can't turn our backs on this. We have to be responsible, and this goes with the way we manage our other nutrients as well. That's not even manure. But I just wanted to put this perspective in here, is that what is good for the farmer is also good for the environment. And you guys know I'm not an environmentalist type person in that context, but the point is, the reality of it is, we need to do a good job. And when we do cover crops and manure right, it'll work out really good. So, okay, questions. Let's stick to our topic here now, and then I know you have a question, Scott, about something else. But questions on manure management, spring manure management, and cover crops. Anybody have a question on that? I was wondering out there in Nebraska, Aaron, do you work with many manure applications?
There are a lot of folks that are applying manure. Most of that's not done in the spring. This has come up a couple times, though, in the last few years, and just this is really good topics and really good pointers that you've made. I think there might be space for doing this over the top of a frost-terminated cover crop in some circumstances.
Okay.
And that would be just a different circumstance that might exist in the spring. So, yeah,
I didn't mention that. Thanks for bringing it up. I see Stephanie, you're on. I'll get you in a second here. I'm glad you mentioned that, Aaron. I literally did not think of that. But when we have a winter killed cover crop like a radish or an oats, how does that work in the spring? And there again, I think you have to analyze, what did that cover crop provide. Hopefully there's some residue there that's going to help keep the manure in its place, especially if there's any type of a slope, from an erosion standpoint. But this is one of the reasons why I like and also recommend for people to have living covers in the spring, because if you do need manure, that dead cover crop is not going to help you anything more than maybe getting it in the ground a little better from an infiltration standpoint, keeping it from washing off, but it's not really going to do much for you from saving your nitrates from either washing off in a rain or leaching down in. So,
yeah, I feel like I've had more questions about when to apply the cover crop seed after wheat. A lot of manure goes on in the summer.
Okay.
Here, and so they wanted to know, should I plant the cover crop first or last? And I think first, get good seed to soil contact, then spread your manure.
My answer to that question in your situation you described is always plant the cover crop first, unless you have a really good reason not to. That's my quick answer, because you want to get that biology, you want to get them living roots, and then spread the manure later when you can, and if you can let it grow, a couple inches, it'll survive a spreading if you do it right. So let's swing back to you, Stephanie, in Indiana. What's your question?
I just was wondering if there's any open space to talk about, I think, compaction with spring manure application, and you kind of touched on a little bit in using the drag lines in those situations, but I think compaction with any activity in the spring is a very real thing, and so I guess, how do you manage that and deal with it, and do you see less compaction on your operation with covers in manure application?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm glad you hit on that, because it's always, almost in most areas and most springs, farmers want to go. They want to go. Let's go. Let's go. It's time to go, and the fields aren't quite ready. So compaction is there's two main things that I think about. Number one, when you have a living root in that soil, it's going to be able to help support the weight of equipment and heavy manure, tanks and so forth, or whatever, spreaders. But you just plant cover crops the first year into what was a dead soil. it still takes a couple years for that structure to build up to the point where it's meaningful and being able to resist compaction. So I remember when I just switched to no-till back in the 80s, I was like, I understood the importance of not being on your soils when they weren't fit, and I was a fanatic about that. I mean, we just did not go in the soils, spread lime, spread fertilizer, spread manure, whatever. We just did not run on those soils. And as the years went by, and now decades, man, we can go in our soils almost any time, and it hardly makes tracks. Even when it is a time where it would have been too wet before. So you earn the right. You earn the right to be able to get on your fields earlier. And before we went live here and recorded this, we were talking a little bit about how I think it was in Iowa where some people were planting and their neighbors weren't because they were planting into living cover crops because it would have been too wet. And there's a point where you can push it too far, but if you understand the dynamics, and you're going to have to try it on your own fields and your own farms to see how this works. But the one of the things nowadays is a lot of custom manure haulers, and they want to keep going and they want to be running 24/7 sometimes. And if they're over in a town and in one side of the county and they have their route planned up and they get a little bit of rain, they want to keep going. As long as they can keep, getting stuck, they want to keep going. So that's an issue you have to deal with. I mean, they're building some wide tires and tracks and all kinds of things now to help. But yeah, compaction is clearly something that needs to be very, very much monitored, but also very much managed. And it's just part of the program here. I think I would just say with cover crops and no-till, you're going to be able to get away with more once you get into the system. So is that helpful, Stephanie?
Yeah, that was great, Steve. I appreciate that.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? While you're thinking, then we'll come over to Scott. He has another question. Next week, I'm going to talk about planting into heavy cover crops. And we'll touch on pretty much this will be a planting green type, but I'm talking about what you can kind of see there in the picture, fully headed out triticale that was thick. And this actually was taken last year on a farm we did for a neighbor. His planter is a no-till planter, but his planter was, well, let's just say was not quite equipped to go through this kind of heavy cover crops. And I think we did pretty good with our planter there. And even though it was a little on the wet side, and that's why he didn't get it planted earlier, but we'll be talking about that next week. So let's just wrap up today's conversation. If there's still questions about manure, that's fine. But Scott, I believe you had a question about something else. What was your other question?
Okay, so my question is mainly about hairy vetch. We're looking at, like with one of my clients, we're looking at growing a green feed in one of the fields this year.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's irrigated. So the moisture will be there. But what I'm looking at is whether we could plant a relay crop. Like we have one of the seed dealers here, one of the seed companies has a relay blend that they recommend, or they say they have some experience with in this. What they're saying is you put in you add, they have Italian ryegrass, annual ryegrass, hairy vetch. And they're saying to add that in at about 12 pounds per acre, and then you along with your cereal. So I guess any experience or any thoughts on that as to whether it's gonna just kind of sit underneath and then grow once the green feed is taken off with the cereal, or what do you think is going to work?
Well, what is your timing of planting the cereal and then the relay or the cover crops here in this case? What is your timing on that? When are they both done?
Well, let's see here. Like the way I understand it is that you'd plant it all at once. But I've kind of
Okay.
wondered whether you could,
Right.
because like herbicide could be an issue with, or
Uh-huh.
would be an issue. So I guess
Right.
like what do you think would be best, or what do you think could work?
I think the best
Won't
here.
be so,
Here's my answer, Scott.
okay.
The best thing would be to try it on a small scale and see what happens,
Yeah.
because now you're at the tip of the spear with this kind of stuff, and I don't think anybody can say yet this is a recipe that will work. So I love to hear these kind of things. And I could tweak the seeding rates and everything, but I'd have to talk to you for a while. The point is, my point, and this is for everybody else, when you start hearing about this relay cropping, companion cropping, and trust me, I'm doing it. I got to put some pictures on the internet of some of the stuff I'm doing because it's looking pretty cool. And I'm starting to figure some things out. So that being said, with what you just suggested is one of those prime things, Scott. You're the man. You guys, you try that, test it out, get back to us, see what happens. Because it's like, how to really rein this into a point of, this is how it really works. I think we're not there yet. And I'm glad to hear that seed companies are involved in this. So I'm happy to hear your question, but I can't give you much of a guidance on specifics. So that's, I mean, I just got to be honest with you.
Okay, yeah. So then even with this hairy vetch, because I know the concerns of having the hard seed and it becoming a weed there. But is it like a slow growing one that if we plant it, like, because it's going to be probably planted in only a few weeks.
Okay.
So is it going to kind of sit there and then really take off more in the fall, like in the cooler weather, or what's it going to do?
Well, you brought up a couple questions. The hard seed is not really a negative unless you're organic and growing small grains.
Okay.
So that you can deal with it. That's my short answer on the hard seed.
Most chemicals and any other most chemicals will take care of it.
Yeah, or they just don't bother it. They just don't bother another cash crop. So you're saying you'll plant a some sort of a 4-H crop here soon once your little snow melts, and you'll get this. See, hairy vetch is a cool season, winter annual, so they ain't gonna do much over the summer. It's just gonna kind of sit there underneath there, and if it survives, it'll start really coming to life then in the fall.
Okay.
And I think that's when you said you want to use it as a green feed. Does that mean grazing or what?
No, like the green feed would be, so if they plant like a cereal, so cutting it in July-ish.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm thinking is that if there's something kind of understory or kind of ready to take off when that gets cut.
Yeah. Well, red clover has historically been done with wheat, and that's pretty much a winner there. You might want to put some red clover in just to use that as a baseline. I do question the hairy vetch. Not sure if that'll work, but then again, you're in Alberta, so you're cooler. It might your longer days and all that stuff may allow it to work over the summer. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but yeah,
because it's normally a fall planted one, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But red clover would be one to try because it's historically done pretty good in a situation like you're talking about.
Okay.
So good. Well, that's a great question. Anybody else have any other questions regarding our topic today about manure and cover crops, or any other cover crop question at all? Anybody else have any more questions?
Hey, Steve.
Yeah, Lloyd.
We are going to try forage soybeans and corn in a twin row, planting soybeans in one side and corn in the other. I was wondering if anybody's ever done that.
I've heard of some people putting it in a 15-inch row in between a 30-inch corn row. I think Dave Brandt did that from Ohio. I'm not sure if I know any other specific examples of that. But is this going to be for grain or for silage?
For silage.
Oh, see, that makes me more excited because you got some protein in there in the soybeans. It'll probably give you a little nitrogen to the corn, right? I mean, that's your idea, right?
That's the thought, yes.
Yeah. I would consider cowpeas too. I mean, if you want to start getting a little, make it a little more confusing or more complex, cowpeas will climb up the corn and maybe get sunlight a little bit better. I've heard that cowpeas have been doing really good in interseeding. So might be something for you to think about there.
Well, we were also going to plant some cowpeas and grazing corn together.
Well, now you're
Couple
talking.
acres.
If you're going to do grazing corn, that implies you're going to do grazing, right?
Well, we were going to bale it.
Oh, you're gonna bale it to sell that then.
Sell it or feed it, depending on
Okay.
demand.
My question is grazing corn better than a sorghum Sudan type?
We don't
For that-
know.
Yeah.
Our cattle didn't like the sorghum Sudan that we planted the last 2 years. They
Oh.
ate it, but they didn't gain very well. And
Okay.
yeah, we had that sun hemp and sorghum last year, and
Mhm.
like I said, they ate it, but
Mhm.
they didn't really like it.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we're trying something different.
Gotcha. Well, you might be on to something. Might be on to something there. Aaron, go ahead.
On that note, I was just going to say the other two species were pigeon peas and sun hemp, and then they specified iron and clay. Cowpeas did pretty well
Okay.
in that interseeding deal. And that sun hemp might not be that palatable. I don't know.
Yeah. Sun hemp,
so
if you pretty much when it gets to the bud stage, it's pretty much over for eating it because it starts to get fibrous really quick. The leaves are still edible, but so you're referencing there more of an interseeding. I think Lloyd's talking about planting including these at planting. They're planted all at once.
Yeah,
right?
and I think it'd probably be similar
Yeah.
in nature.
Yeah.
Because this is like V3 planting.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
No, the other thing is I've always wondered what a sunflower would do in a silage mix, but
well, I've heard of some
pretty
people
edible.
trying that. I was in Wisconsin this winter, and there was a guy who was trying that. I mean, I have to ask the question, where's the feed value in that? I'm not really sure. It looked pretty cool though. I'll tell you that. He planted them with the corn, so I enjoy hearing about this stuff, but I caution people not to go too big on it until they know what they're doing.
Yeah,
a little bit.
I really like that sentiment that says 10% of your 4%.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Bob Recker's
There you go.
guide there. It is a good guide. Yeah, that's for sure.
Comes out to like a half an acre per quarter.
Right. Yeah, and that's for trying something crazy. So.
Yeah, yeah, I like that
Scott.
idea too.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna talk to the client about that idea too. Yeah. So
Okay.
just try some of the crazier things, but yeah, don't go full on
Yep.
something really new. So
yeah. Good practical advice.
Mhm.
Any other questions for today? We're kind of wrapping up, but I don't want to hold anybody off here. Any other questions anybody has? Well, thanks so much. Next week we're going to talk about planting into heavy covers. In the meantime, I hope most of you dry out the way it sounds, and have a great week. Stay curious and keep learning.